joining us today to talk about direct rental assistance and how this innovative model for housing assistance could benefit both participants and landlords. We're going to be placing everyone on mute for the discussion, but feel free to introduce yourself right now in the chat box. Let us know where you're based, where you're tuning in from today, and if you're representing an organization, what organization you're representing. So I'll give you just a minute to go ahead and let us know who's in the audience via the chat. See, we have some of my colleagues from BRHP joining. Glad to have you all. Representatives from DHCD. Some of our board members are tuning in. Welcome, Bill. Got some property management teams on the line. Current participants as well. Lots of local folks to the Baltimore region. Wonderful. Continue to let us know as you join your name, your affiliation, where you're joining us from. I'm Adria Crutchfield, the Executive Director at the Baltimore Regional Housing Partnership. We are based in downtown Baltimore, so that's where I'm joining you from today. We are a nonprofit with the mission of expanding housing choices for families with low incomes who have historically been excluded from housing and opportunities in well-resourced neighborhoods. As the regional administrator of the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program, BRHP couples Housing Choice Vouchers with housing counseling supports to over 4,300 families, primarily families with children, in accessing and transitioning successfully to safe, healthy, and economically vibrant communities throughout the Baltimore region. So that's here in Baltimore City and then the 5 surrounding counties. If you are familiar with the Housing Choice Voucher Program, it is a federally funded program that serves about 2.2 million households nationwide. It makes housing in the private market more affordable to eligible families with low incomes, people with disabilities, and older adults by providing rental assistance that makes up the difference between the market rate rent and 30% of the renter's adjusted gross monthly income. The program has been incredibly successful in helping low-income families access quality housing. And at the same time, it's encouraging to see that leaders in the field of housing assistance are continuing to look for improvements and innovations to how we administer rental assistance better and ensure that more people can access the benefits of a stable home. Here at BRHP, we see firsthand the importance of flexible solutions for housing assistance and the potential of direct rental assistance solutions to help families, and that's why we're excited to be hosting this discussion today. We hope that you gain some insight on what direct rental assistance might look like in the future and a potential shift in the way in which we provide housing assistance and how that could potentially help families access quality housing more easily. We'll have a question and answer session towards the end of the meeting where you can ask questions. Feel free to type your questions into the chat at any time. And then when we get to the Q&A, if you'd like to ask your question, raise your hand and we will unmute you. With that, now let me turn to our guest of honor. Paul Joice is a research analyst at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, whose work involves researching ways to better address the needs of low-income families across America. His research has been published in several journals, including Cityscapes, the journal produced by the HUD Office of Policy Development and Research. While Paul is a HUD researcher, it's important to note that he is not here today speaking on behalf of HUD. Paul, it is great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Adria. Thank you so much for inviting me here, and thank you for the kind introduction. And thanks to the BRHP team. You all do great work. It's so important. And these events are really cool. I applaud you for learning and exploring big ideas alongside your stakeholders. So I'm coming from Chicago on the South Side. I worked at HUD headquarters in DC for a few years. I started my career at HUD in 2007. And within a few months, I saw firsthand just how important housing policy is as the foreclosure crisis took hold and spread across the country and led to the Great Recession. During those years, I worked on a program called the Neighborhood Stabilization Program, which helped to provide assistance to neighborhoods hit hardest by the foreclosure crisis. And in the years since, I've led research on a variety of HUD programs, including disaster recovery and public housing redevelopment, and more recently, the voucher program. So I've seen time and time again the importance of stable housing, and I'm really excited. I love this work and really excited to wake up every day and think about big ideas and big solutions to the very, very big challenge of housing affordability.
Absolutely. So let's do some setting of the stage to begin. Most people joining us for the event are familiar with the existing Housing Choice Voucher Program, the HUD program that provides rental assistance via landlord payments to approved low-income households. This program enjoys broad support among researchers, policymakers, practitioners, because vouchers have proven to be effective at reducing rent burden, overcrowding, homelessness, and housing instability. That said, we can all acknowledge that there are challenges within the HCV program, particularly as it relates to the following. One, a discrepancy between the availability of funding and utilization rates. The federal government spends about $30 billion each year on the HCV program, but only 61% of voucher recipients in 2019 were able to use their vouchers. Here at BRHP, we have a success rate that ranges between 90 and 93% and a utilization rate of 97 to 99%, largely attributable to the housing counseling supports that we provide and our rigorous monitoring of our lease-ups. However, nationally, you see PHAs that don't have the same success and utilization rates. So what are some of your thoughts on these persistent challenges in the HCV program?
Yeah, well, first I want to echo your praise for the voucher program. There's a lot of research, as you said, demonstrating positive outcomes for families that get assistance through the program. I also want to note that the program has made a lot of progress in recent years to address some shortcomings, specifically related to helping voucher households access more neighborhoods, better neighborhoods. So the work that BRHP does is so important there. HUD has also implemented smaller area fair market rents, which make it so that people can make it easier for people to access higher rent neighborhoods. So these are important reforms. And the challenges that remain with the program really stem from the fact that many landlords refuse to rent to voucher holders. This has been common knowledge for anybody who works in the field or has experience with the program, but until recently, we didn't have hard evidence of that. But a few years ago, the Urban Institute did a study with HUD funding that applied rigorous housing discrimination methods to look at how frequently landlords turn away voucher holders. And in 3 of the 5 sites that they studied, they found more than 2/3 of landlords flat out refused to consider a voucher holder. And the rejection rate was higher in lower poverty neighborhoods. And when landlords don't accept vouchers, that makes it incredibly hard for people to join the program. You mentioned the success rate of about 60%. That means 60% of people who are issued a voucher are able to find a unit and join the program. And the other 40% search, but can't find a unit that meets the requirements or can't find the landlord that will take the voucher, and the household has to give that voucher back to the PHA. So this is incredible when you think about how life-changing a voucher can be. It's a very generous, deep subsidy that someone can keep for as long as they're eligible. And the fact that so many people have to give that up reflects a real problem.
Absolutely. And so this DRA program that we're going to talk a little bit more about today could potentially unlock some of that, those challenges, address some of those challenges and increase the utilization and success rates. So before we pivot to that, what other ways are there that we might address some of these current challenges within the HCV program?
That's a good question. Direct rental assistance is certainly not the only solution, and the voucher program, there are many reforms that have been pursued and could be pursued to improve the way that the program performs. So the source of income discrimination is one important policy to consider. Under federal law, source of income is not a protected class, but a growing number of states and local governments are passing laws that ban discrimination on the basis of a source of income. So that would prevent landlords from legally denying someone because they have a voucher. And the Urban Institute study that I mentioned had 5 sites. In 3 sites, there was a very high rejection rate. In the other 2 sites, landlord rejection of vouchers was lower. In one site, it was 15%, and in the other site, it was about 30%. Those 2 sites had source of income protection laws. So on the one hand, those sites, they had lower voucher rejection rates, but it wasn't zero. So even when you say it's illegal to discriminate against someone with a voucher, some landlords will still do it. So that's one drawback to that approach. And also it's important to note that those source of income discrimination laws are really hard to enforce. Landlords, it's just hard for fair housing organizations to catch that kind of behavior, and they need resources to do that. Another strategy for addressing some of these problems is landlord incentives. And Adria, you mentioned that BRHP has a much higher success rate than the national average. And I think that the services that you provide to tenants and to landlords probably makes a big difference there. And HUD is very interested, and a lot of PHAs are very interested in pursuing incentives to make the voucher program more attractive to landlords. This is an active area of exploration and research, and I hope to see whether those policies are effective. But if any of these other approaches come up short, direct rental assistance is maybe a bigger, bolder idea to combat some of these challenges we talked about.
Absolutely, and I think it's important just to note that just because there might be a potential new route to provide rental assistance doesn't mean that some of these things you've just talked about would be going away. So thinking about the history of how we ended up with the Housing Choice Voucher Program, what was the Experimental Housing Allowance Program, EHAP? What did it demonstrate in terms of other possibilities to provide housing assistance, particularly direct rental assistance to low-income households?
Yeah, so the Section 8 program was created in 1974. It eventually became the voucher program. But we're now celebrating the 50th anniversary of this tenant-based rental assistance model. So it's a big milestone. And a few years before Section 8 was created, in the early 70s, HUD ran EHAP, the Experimental Housing Allowance Program. And EHAP provided the proof of concept for tenant-based rental assistance, because before that, everything was project-based. It was public housing. No one knew whether this kind of rental assistance could work. So EHAP demonstrated that it could work. Tenant-based assistance was feasible. But before that research on EHAP was even done, Congress created Section 8. And what's really interesting about EHAP and Section 8, or the voucher program, is that EHAP was a housing allowance, which is basically what we're talking about now with direct rental assistance. So the money is provided to the renter instead of the landlord, but the Congress created Section 8 with a different model requiring that the payment go directly to the landlord. So that's interesting that from the beginning of this program, it hasn't followed the original idea that the policy wonks and researchers were exploring.
Thanks for that history. So shifting to today, could you give the audience a basic understanding of this concept of direct rental assistance?
Yeah, so at a very basic level, it's rental assistance provided to a renter and to help them pay their rent. And they would be responsible for paying the full rent to the landlord. That's obviously in contrast to the voucher model, where the tenant pays a portion and the housing authority pays the assistance, the subsidy, directly to the landlord. But beyond that very basic definition, direct rental assistance could mean a lot of different things. There are a few, I'd say three general versions. The first is something very similar to the voucher program. The amount of the assistance would be a deep subsidy, enough so that a very low income household wouldn't be rent burdened. And it would be long-term assistance like the voucher program, potentially indefinite for as long as a person is eligible. But another model, potential model, is something that's like short-term emergency rental assistance for somebody who is falling behind on their rent. Maybe they get a set amount for just to get caught up on the rent. And then a third model is something maybe more like guaranteed basic income, where it's cash assistance going to a household. And the expectation is that they'll use it for rent because rent is the largest expense facing most low-income renters, or most renters, period. To be clear, when I talk about direct rental assistance, I'm really thinking about the first model, something similar to the voucher program. But there are a lot of innovative ideas out there and people could be exploring different models.
Can you share a little bit more about HUD's role in evaluating DRA, these various models that we might see come to fruition, and any next steps in terms of testing or implementing DRA?
Yeah, so HUD is interested in improving the voucher program, obviously, and interested in looking for other innovative ways to help with the affordable housing crisis. At the moment, HUD is not designing or implementing a DRA program. We've been engaging in discussions with various people who are interested in this idea. HUD is working to support housing authorities that are interested in developing DRA pilots, and we're eager to learn from any local DRA pilots that are implemented by housing authorities or other organizations.
I'll just mention quickly that BRHP is participating with a small group of folks in terms of a potential program design for possible implementation of DRA. Can you say a little bit more though about what HUD is allowing PHAs to potentially do?
Well, those constraints are still being worked out, but HUD has informed housing authorities with MTW status, the MTW demonstration program, that they can do direct rental assistance under certain conditions, and those other conditions are still being worked out. I'm not the main person handling that, so it's still to come.
Totally understand, and we're going to stay tuned for sure. My basic understanding is that MTW agencies will be permitted to use some portion of their HAP or their housing assistance payment towards this. So Paul, what are some of your thoughts around any concerns that the public might have in terms of paying rental assistance directly to low-income families instead of to landlords? What might be your response to a person who expresses concerns about whether or not that money is then spent on rent versus something else that the family might need to spend money on?
Yeah, this is one of the main concerns that I've heard from people who are skeptical of direct rental assistance. And I think we need to take it seriously, because if people get DRA and then don't pay the rent, it would create a lot of problems. If landlords don't get paid, that's obviously bad for their business. And it would be bad for tenants, because when landlords don't get paid, they pursue eviction. It would be bad for PHAs and HUD as well if government rental assistance funds aren't being used to pay the rent. So I think it's important that particularly a PHA, but really any organization doing direct rental assistance needs to make it really clear to tenants that they have to pay their rent. And DRA policies could include other measures to prevent non-payment. That said, I'm optimistic that this will not be a widespread problem. As they say, the rent eats first. There are already severe consequences to not paying your rent, right? Eviction. I find it hard to imagine that somebody who has rental assistance would choose not to pay their rent. They would risk getting evicted and risk losing the rental assistance. When people end up in an eviction situation, it's usually because they can't avoid it. They don't have the money to pay the rent. But if they're getting rental assistance, then this really is not a scenario that should happen under a well-designed program. But the bottom line is I don't have a crystal ball, and that's why it's important to do pilots and do research and gather evidence to answer these questions. And this would be a key issue for researchers to monitor.
Do you have anything to say about landlords in particular, maybe having preferences?
Yeah, so one of the things that landlords really like about the voucher program is that guaranteed monthly payment from the PHA. Giving money to the tenant instead introduces some risk to landlords, so it's important to design a policy in a way that minimizes that risk. And, again, it goes back to what I was saying, that it's important to try to make sure that tenants understand and that the PHA has procedures to make sure that the rent is being paid, because if landlords get the idea that this is a big risk in the direct rental assistance model, then they won't be inclined to take tenants with direct rental assistance. And that's the very same challenge we have in the voucher program that we're hoping to avoid.
Absolutely. One of the things we're most excited about is that DRA could potentially really open more individual choice for voucher recipients. What are your thoughts on ensuring any tracking or monitoring, though, of the program doesn't end up creating similar administrative burdens that we see in the HCV program?
Yeah, administrative burden is a really important thing to think about here. An important goal of direct rental assistance is to simplify and streamline rental assistance, to make it easier for renters to use and to take advantage of the program, also to make it easier for landlords and to make it easier for PHAs to manage. And so there's a risk that going overboard with monitoring could, again, kind of defeat the purpose of testing this model. One idea that has been considered is to use something like an EBT card, like the SNAP program, that could be set up to only allow the funds to be used to pay the rent. This is interesting, but I don't think it would work in the housing context because landlords rarely take credit card payments, and there would be a whole lot of administrative infrastructure that would have to be developed for a SNAP-like model. Another idea is to provide to require that the tenant provide the PHA with rent receipts. That would create a pretty substantial burden on tenants. I think the option that strikes the best balance is simply to set up a mechanism for a landlord to contact the PHA if the tenant's not paying rent. If someone's getting direct rental assistance and not paying the rent, that's a problem. Like the PHA should intervene there and figure out what's going on. And that could also address landlord concerns and obviously help tenants avoid eviction. There's something wrong in that kind of scenario that needs an action by the tenant, landlord, and PHA together.
Folks join. So if you join, I want you to start thinking about pivot pretty soon to opening up the Q&A to the audience. So go ahead and drop your question in the chat. We will call on you potentially to ask that question in just a few minutes. Paul, what are some other considerations maybe outside of the HCV program that you do think those of us who might be in the program design phase of this should consider?
So I think direct rental assistance should mirror the voucher program in some important ways. It should use the same eligibility criteria, more or less. It should be focused on serving low-income renters, and it should be a deep subsidy. But it could vary in the details. It wouldn't have to use the exact same subsidy calculation method as the voucher program. There could be some different approaches to explore there. The most important issue is housing quality, whether or how to have something like the inspection that's part of the voucher the voucher process. Inspections are one of the most commonly cited concerns from landlords. In particular, the delay. Inspections sometimes can take a long time to schedule and get completed, and sometimes inspectors are a little bit inconsistent. Some are pickier than others, and it can be frustrating for landlords. And so having that exact same process play out within for a household who's receiving direct rental assistance might again cause landlords to just not be interested and refuse to go along with it. So it's important to find some lower burden way to address housing quality concerns. And go ahead.
I was just going to mention, currently, my understanding is the HCV program does not impact other benefits that families may be receiving. What are your thoughts in terms of a DRA being similarly considered?
Yeah, that's right. It's important to make sure that direct rental assistance is not treated as income. If a housing authority gives money to a renter to pay the rent, someone might look at that and say, this is money, this is income. And other public programs might count that as income and reduce benefits. That would be a big problem. I think that should be a problem that we should be able to avoid if we're really clear that this is rental assistance. It's not a guaranteed income or something like that. And agencies, whether it's at the federal level, HUD, or local level, housing authorities can work with other public program administrators to try to address those barriers, to get waivers, hopefully. But it is really important to focus on this being rental assistance for that very reason.
We absolutely agree. My final question before we shift to the audience, the fact that nearly 40% of current voucher recipients fail to successfully use the voucher, as we mentioned at the top of our discussion, shows that expanding reach requires more than additional funding. It may require program reform. And again, that's one of the reasons why BRHP believes DRA is so exciting, has a lot of potential. I'm just wondering what other ideas are on the horizon that are currently being researched that make you excited about potential changes in how we provide rental assistance.
Well, I already mentioned a couple, like the landlord incentives and small area fair market rents. Another one is that HUD is changing the inspection framework. HUD has a new inspection protocol, and I'm really interested to see how that plays out and how it affects housing quality and how it affects the burden on landlords and PHAs as well. And HUD has never gotten housing quality data related to the voucher program. PHAs don't report that information to HUD, so we have a little bit of a blind spot there, but it would be really interesting to look at the new inspection protocols and see data on what kind of, how frequently units fail inspections and what are common reasons that they fail, things like that.
Thanks for that. So it looks like we have a number of participants who have joined, and I see a number of questions that have been dropped in the chat that I think I'm going to pivot to. Let's see, maybe we'll start with just one that you've mentioned, but I think it's important to reemphasize. Would the DRA be considered income? And so could you reiterate your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so for federal taxes, I think it's very clear it would not be considered income. The IRS has something called a general welfare exclusion where assistance provided to an individual, something like a voucher or food assistance, is definitely not counted as income. And I think that direct rental assistance would clearly be captured under that. So for taxes and other programs that are based on IRS definitions of income, that would include Medicaid, I don't think that that would be a concern. Other programs like TANF and SNAP, it's a little bit more questionable and would require, I'm actually in the process of discussing with USDA staff whether direct rental assistance would be excluded for SNAP. And then for TANF is administered, really states have a lot of discretion. So that's a little bit trickier to handle at the federal level. But one option to consider is to have some kind of hold harmless fund to offset any benefit reductions that can't be avoided. But ideally, you'd be able to negotiate with state agencies to say, like, this is housing assistance. It should be treated the same way as a housing voucher.
Thanks for that. I see a question here from a former BRHP team member. Can you talk about the plans for implementing a DRA trial here in the Baltimore region? Is a trial being planned? I don't mind taking that one. Zelma, thank you so much for joining us. BRHP and HABC are engaged with some other PHAs across the country, as well as a researcher in designing what a potential pilot could look like. But I would say we're far off from an actual pilot being implemented just yet. We're gathering together to see, what might be feasible and work for a variety of PHAs across the country in terms of whether or not then a pilot could potentially be taken underway. But definitely we're engaged with others, and there is excitement about, again, some of the benefits that we think this could provide. One thing that we haven't talked about so much, but I will just say is we're somewhat hopeful, that this would ease this or potentially get rid of the stigma that has been associated with the HCV program for so long. And, again, with source of income protection still staying in place, but with potentially, less visibility into there being some subsidy provided to families, how then they might be treated in the private market. And we would hope that they would be treated better and more like a fair market rate tenant. I don't know, Paul, if you want to mention anything else about other trials that you know of, but.
Well, I'll mention that there's a project in Philadelphia. It's called Philadelphia Housing or PHL Housing Plus, where they are already testing a direct rental assistance model. They started it a couple of years ago. It's really promising. They haven't shared results yet, but I'm looking forward to seeing results from that. And I think a number of other housing authorities are pretty much in the same place that you are. They're exploring this, but not quite ready to implement. Folks haven't settled on an exact model. And in fact, none of the housing authorities have yet proposed anything officially to HUD. So we're still waiting and in the exploratory stage.
What are your thoughts in terms of tenant rights and just how we might, how, if any, changes or what, if any, changes there might be in terms of protections for tenants who would be enrolled in a DRA program versus an HCV program?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's a concern that I've heard from a number of advocacy organizations. In the voucher program, tenant protections are enforced by the HAP contract. The landlord signs that contract when they agree to participate, and so they have to comply with that. And with direct rental assistance, they're almost certainly wouldn't be a HAP contract, and that would limit the ability of the housing authority to crack down on a landlord that misbehaves. So I think it would be more important to have a really robust local tenant protection framework, and in particular to have a robust legal aid framework to help people who encounter problems with their landlord.
There's a question here about how long voucher holders would be allowed potentially in the DRA program. Do you maybe want to talk about how you think that would change or remain the same?
Yeah, so in the voucher program, a person can generally keep the assistance for as long as they're eligible. Under direct rental assistance, it's hard to answer that question because you could think of direct rental assistance as a temporary pilot for research purposes to learn about how this model works, or you could think of it as a program that could exist forever. And if you think of it as a program that has been established by Congress and authorized and run by a housing authority, it could potentially be like the voucher program, where once you get it, you can keep it for as long as you're eligible. But in the context of a pilot program, it would really depend on how the housing authority or other folks design the program. Could be a couple of years. I think it would be really important that if it is a temporary program, that anybody who participates would have a way to convert to the voucher program at the end of the pilot, and that I think the pilot should be long enough that people who are participating actually have a chance to experience the program and make some decisions. And if they want to move, they could think about moving. If it's too short, then people won't have those opportunities to consider moving and improving their housing situation.
I appreciate you mentioning that. In terms of how BRHP is starting to think about this, we absolutely believe that anyone that might be enrolled in a trial or a pilot program would still be eligible at the conclusion for then a tenant-based voucher in the HCV program if the direct rental assistance program was to go away. So thanks for mentioning that. A question from one of our staff: what might it look like to combine counseling services such as BRHP's housing mobility counseling with a DRA program, or how might it be different in your opinion?
Well, I don't know. I don't know how it would be different on the day-to-day basis. I would ask you that. But I do think it would be really important to test direct rental assistance in conjunction with mobility services. I think that could be a really promising combination. It would be important to learn about how that works. And this isn't an answer to that exact question, but I think an important thing to think about with direct rental assistance is that it really empowers tenants, but it also gives them a lot of responsibility. It gives them the responsibility of paying the rent every month. And it's hard to be a renter. It's hard to navigate all the stuff that renters have to deal with. And with direct rental assistance, the housing authority can still be there to help the tenant, but there could potentially be a little bit less of a role for the housing authority with dealing with the landlord. And so it's important to make sure that people who are participating in a direct rental assistance program are ready for that. And it would be good to provide certainly mobility counseling, but also like budget classes, training on managing your finances, and all sorts of different supportive services that would still be really valuable and helpful for a housing authority.
Yeah, I agree with you in terms of, I think a lot of the housing mobility counseling would be very similar. As you know, tenants who do have a portion of the rent to pay already experience having to pay a portion of the rent, even with our subsidy. But I do think there might be a more concerted effort needed around tenants' rights and making sure they're aware of legal aid resources and such if the PHA no longer has a role in terms of dealing directly with an owner. But otherwise, I think a lot of the housing counseling supports would remain, and I agree with you, they should be tested in terms of outcomes. Can you share what some of the incentives would be to engage landlords, as mentioned, who might consider leasing to someone or participating in this? They might unknowingly actually be participating in the program, honestly.
Yeah, so I'm not sure about landlord incentives within a DRA model. In the voucher program, common landlord incentives include a signing bonus. And so one landlord incentive that is being explored in the voucher program that could also be useful under direct rental assistance is something like a damage mitigation fund, to say like the housing authority is setting aside a certain amount of money, and if a landlord has damages to their unit and they can demonstrate that that was caused by a voucher tenant that they had, then they could get reimbursed for that. This is the thing that it's kind of a stereotype that landlords have. They're worried that their unit's going to get damaged, and whether they're right or wrong to give this insurance might be just enough to like make them feel comfortable with the model, and it may not even be something that you'd have to make payments on. If voucher tenants don't cause damage, there's no problem.
Yeah, and I think some of what you mentioned earlier in terms of, you could see a change in the inspection requirement, for example, the doing away with a HAP contract also minimizes the administrative burden, I would say, on an owner in terms of participating. So I think those could also be considered potential incentives that might make a landlord actually more interested in leasing if the program proves to be very similar to just leasing to someone in the regular market. I see another question here, again, from a BRHP team member. So it sounds like you're leaving it up, HUD is leaving it up to PHAs to design a program that best suits their needs, rather than proposing a program to PHAs to administer. And that's correct, right, Paul? Anything more to add to that?
Yeah, so the course that we're on right now is that MTW PHAs have the flexibility to explore this model, but HUD really defers to MTW PHAs about coming up with local solutions that meet their needs. For HUD to design and implement a DRA demonstration would require it would require direction from Congress. Congress would have to make clear that we're authorized to do that and funded to do that and so on. And in the absence of that, housing authorities are in the lead. Housing authorities and other stakeholders, researchers, any organization that can get other funding, like from philanthropies. There's a lot of innovation happening that's outside of HUD.
Yeah, I do think it'll be quite interesting for HUD to start seeing what folks on the ground come up with in terms of different program design. Let's see, one more question here. One of the main reasons landlords accept voucher holders is because of the guaranteed rent. And again, we've kind of addressed this earlier, but if you give a renter the cash instead of giving it directly to the landlord, will this not hurt the tenant's chances of getting accepted for a unit?
So I want to kind of flip the script here, and we've been talking a lot about the voucher program and how direct rental assistance could improve upon the voucher program. And but another way to think about all of this is to think about all of the renters out there who don't have a voucher. Only 1 in 4 eligible renters gets housing assistance. There are a lot of low-income renters out there who are struggling to pay the rent every month. They're paying the full rent themselves. They are making their own decisions about housing quality. They're doing the best that they can to navigate without any assistance. Think about how much better off all of those people would be if they just had a little bit more money to pay the rent. And without any of the additional stuff involved with the voucher program, just a little bit extra money. So it's important to think about how direct rental assistance could work relative to the voucher program, but it's also important to think about how it could work relative to the status quo that most renters are experiencing. And also to think about that from the landlord perspective. Like maybe a landlord would prefer to have a voucher, a tenant with a voucher rather than a tenant with direct rental assistance. But I guarantee you they'd rather have a tenant with direct rental assistance than a similar tenant without any assistance, because that person with direct rental assistance has more money to pay the rent. The landlord is more likely to get the rent paid. And so for landlords, it all comes down to what their other options are. Like, what is that other tenant that they could get if they don't have somebody with a voucher or somebody with direct rental assistance?
And similar to the HCV program, I imagine DRA assistance would change accordingly, or could potentially change accordingly with one's income going up or down. And that is, I think, something that landlords are very appealing about the current HCV program. I see one comment here around localities with the rental registry with an inspection component could be a good opportunity to test a model without a separate inspection process like the HCV program. Any thoughts on that, Paul?
I agree. I think that would be really interesting to test direct rental assistance in that context. Yeah. I mean, why should, again, to think about people with housing assistance compared to people without housing assistance, all those other renters out there without any assistance, shouldn't there be rules and regulations to try to improve housing quality for those people too? And so for cities that have policies related to rental registries and inspections, they're trying to cover every rental unit, not just the ones where people are lucky enough to get a voucher.
Yeah, thank you so much for kind of mentioning the broader scope of who really needs affordable housing and who's currently eligible but not receiving a housing choice voucher. I think that's critically important. Paul, any final thoughts before we wrap up in terms of DRA, what's on the horizon? Anything to leave us with in terms of things we need to do or actions we can take to further educate folks about this?
It's exciting. There are also a lot of unanswered questions here, and so I think it's good for people to be creative. And I would caution everyone not to think, oh, like HUD's got it figured out or BRHP has it figured out. This is still, this idea is under development. There's room for a lot of different ideas and ways to test it out, room for a lot of input from a lot of different people. Definitely important to get input from participants and from landlords in the policy design and implementation process. So this is exciting and still early stages.
Absolutely. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Paul, again, for your insights on this new and very exciting possibility for the future of housing assistance. We hope that you'll stay connected with us. Sign up for updates from BRHP at brhp.org. Follow us on social media. We are on X, formerly Twitter, as well as Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. We'll be sending a feedback survey and hope that you'll take a moment to complete that as well. Feel free to suggest future topics that you might be interested in hearing about or future guests that you'd like to hear from. Thank you again all for being here. Have a great rest of your week.